What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we have a review of the new album A View from the Top of the World from Dream Theater. Even if you're not a big-time fan, chances are you've heard the name Dream Theater before. This powerhouse of a progressive metal band formed back in the 80s, cranking out early classics in the genre like Images and Words and Metropolis Part 2, as well as making pretty much every member a household name. A View from the Top of the World is Dream Theater's 15th album in their over 30 years of existence, now crossing 4 different decades. Given that the album's lengthy 1 hour and 11-minute runtime is broken down into just 7 songs, I thought it would be fun once again to take this one track by track. The Alien is a very strong opener with that delicious little drum solo kicking off a fantastic instrumental intro, setting the tone for all of the impressive progressive instrumentation and broad dynamics still to come. It then jumps from the bouncy technical rush riffs into more of a Queen-like power guitar lead. And while I've said before that the vocals are my least favorite aspect of Dream Theater's sound, this is an example of a song where they actually work very well even for me. James's approach here perfectly complements the instrumentation without ever distracting from it with any showboatery, even if the lyrics can be a little cheesy at times. I also love the hand drums later on, kicking off another big instrumental section with a broad spectrum of stylistic experimentation, face-melting soloing from both the keys and guitar, and more very Rush-inspired sounding rhythm parts. Answering the Call then picks up with a very cool and almost surprisingly heavy kind of melodic death metal riff with chugging palm mutes alternated with fun little bursts of pull-offs. The constantly shifting pace changes between this riff and the singing parts actually reminds me quite a bit of Panic Attack. And not to be outdone, Rudess comes hard with flourishes of classical piano, big explosions of strings, and an interesting atmospheric part that has kind of a Zelda Ice Temple energy to it. And like the perfect icing on the cake, there's that bluesy dirtbag Lamb of God riff building into an absolute hurricane series of solos. Invisible Monster goes for a more dramatic symphonic approach that feels similar to material from The Astonishing with its Broadway musical energy. Overall, this one feels like a much more vocal-centric track, with James really giving one of his best performances to date, driven along initially by a simple but effective driving bass riff. When you face the creature that waits beneath your bed. But that doesn't mean there aren't a ton of incredible ups and downs going on in the background across all instruments. Petrucci in particular really does an excellent job of blending in with everyone else into one perfect unit while still delivering some absolutely killer hooks. Sleeping Giant, seemingly true to its name, starts off with a quiet yet eerie and ominous intro before the big lumbering Metallica power chords kick in. The synths on this one have a little enslaved atmosphere to them in places that I really like, and actually plenty of great synth work in general in a lot of different styles. The organ sections had me reflecting back once more on Between the Buried and Me's Colors 2 from earlier this year, and then a more Middle Eastern sounding vibe a little further on. This is one of the longer songs on the album at 10 minutes, and fortunately Dream Theater managed to justify this time with a lot of great progression and overall dynamics. There are some really awesome twists and turns, especially in the final third, including an unexpected piano part that I almost just don't want to spoil. Even the slower parts remind me of that classic mathy YYZ riff. Some will be driven by conflict. Transcending Time is perhaps the biggest outlier of the album, with a much more overtly upbeat kind of energy. The type of music you'd hear in a movie when the main character wakes up and stretches as they see the sun rising for a new day. Lots of classic 70s and 80s rock in there too, like a fusion of moving pictures era Rush with Boston, and maybe just the slightest touch of Coheed and Cambria, as weird as that may sound. Illusions turn to dust. Sky I even caught some Ninja Sex Party vibes, which makes sense when you consider that those guys are influenced by all of those same groups. I actually kept waiting for the lyrics to get kinda silly because of that. It does take a bit of a tonal turn for the interlude, but only very briefly. Overall, a well-constructed and performed song, but definitely the corniest sounding one on the album. But hey, sometimes corny can be fun, and honestly, it's been growing on me. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we then get Awaken the Master, which opens with arguably the heaviest instrumentation of the entire album and honestly of Dream Theater's entire discography. Like seriously, this intro is a certified bop. Very infectious groove complemented by more fun organ and 70s 80s influenced synth sounds. It also has a nice long instrumental intro that actually had me hoping the entire thing would be one big multi-textured journey completely sans vocals. Ultimately there are some, but comparatively they're pretty sparing and once more act as a complement to the other instruments that knows when to get out of their way, which really is most of the time. Very impressive orchestration across the board on this song and packed with more memorable moments from the powerful mashing of the echoing keys all the way to the big dramatic strings of the outro. Another easy favorite that stuck with me from the very beginning. Awaken the Master. But speaking of dramatic moments, that only leaves the big conclusion, the 20+ minute title track. This one opens with the same great orchestral sounding elements as well as some extra brass to really up the anticipation in its opening minutes. And there's also another awesome bass groove on this song that really reminded me of Between the Buried and Me. And of course, lots of great little earworm guitar hooks as well. Much like with the previous track, this is a masterwork of progressive songwriting, but unlike that one, I do feel like the vocals actually subtract from its overall impact rather than adding to it here. The chorus in particular feels kind of shoehorned in and overly simplistic in comparison to everything else. It's just kind of flat and lifeless, which is in stark contrast to all of this wild shit that starts happening around the 7-minute mark. Fortunately, they still make up for a pretty small minority of the runtime, and then just talk about dynamics on this song. Later on, it opens up for a slower section that feels straight out of Dark Side of the Moon, but also with the addition of what sounds to be a live cello performance, which then in turn gives way to some really awesome guitar hooks of a completely different flavor in the final third, punctuated by an awesome drum solo for the transition. Yeah, the percussion on this track in general is a real treat. Overall, another incredible opus to add to the pantheon of epic Dream Theater tracks. Bringing it all together, I'm actually shocked at how much I enjoyed this album. For further context, I actually managed to avoid listening to a single Dream Theater record despite being well aware of them since high school. I then binged the entire discography for the first time in preparation for a tier list video, and even with all of those classic moments in my brain, I was still pretty blown away by the time I got to this one. Turning to my scales, I give A View from the Top of the World a 9 for enjoyability. There are just a few little nitpicks that honestly keep this album from being a 10 in this realm, but I really do try to save a perfect score for complete perfection. Speaking of which, I do give it a 10 for musicianship, and I'll go so far to say that this is both some of the best and tightest songwriting and strongest performances of Dream Theater's entire career. And I give it an 8 for innovation. I'd say that if you're familiar with Dream Theater already, you'll more or less know what to expect, but even so, I think that they did enough to mature their sound even so many years into their career that they deserve that extra point. So a 9 overall and an A- for Dream Theater and A View from the Top of the World. Let me know what you thought of this album down in the comments, and be sure to stick around for more reviews and my Dream Theater discography tier list. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.